Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm Chris. For today's video, I'm going to talk about the Olympus E-M5 Mark I. Some of you might remember that a couple weeks ago, I did a video where I repaired a E-M5 Mark I using two broken E-M5s to make a good one. Now, after I did the repair, I took the camera out, and it turns out I really enjoy shooting with the camera. And, that's why we're here. Now, for a bit of context, some of you may already know, but I'm not super new to the Micro Four Thirds system. I already did videos on my GH1 and my infrared converted G1. I also have the GH4 and Olympus EPL5. But anyways, today we're going to go through the Olympus E-M5 Mark I. We're going to talk about the camera's details and specs, and what it's like to use, and why I think it's a pretty great way to get into Micro Four Thirds, while getting to have some of the more convenient, nice touches of a modern camera, and not breaking the bank. So let's get into it. So what is the Olympus E-M5 Mark I? Well, in short, this is the Olympus E-M5 Mark I. It's a Micro Four Thirds camera that came out in February of 2012. And it's a camera that was heavily inspired by Olympus OM range cameras. Now, this is pretty great because here we have an Olympus OM1, and you may notice it is very pretty. So that's a good thing. Now, the EM5 features some pretty serious features for a Micro Four Thirds camera at the time. Remember, this was the era of Olympus producing basically the Olympus Pen series and the lower end EPL and EPM series cameras, which were nice cameras, but definitely geared more towards enthusiasts and casual photographers, given the fact that these cameras didn't have a built-in EVF and were built kind of to be a smaller pocketable camera with less command dials than a traditional larger camera would have. Now, the Olympus EM5 featured some pretty serious things to kind of push back into the market of more serious photography, and that would be things like the weather sealing. This camera does have weather sealing on it. So nice. Now, the other thing that this camera has, it's a 16 megapixel sensor, which at the time was fairly new for Micro Four Thirds, and it could shoot at a fairly quick frame rate of 9 frames per second. It also introduced Olympus's more advanced 5-axis stabilization. I believe this was the first camera to feature it. And the camera's base ISO was a 200 and could go up all the way to 25,600. The shutter is good for 60 seconds, or 1/4000th of a second. And the back of the camera, over here, is a 3-inch touch panel, which featured 610 K dots. Now, the EVF over here, that is 1.44 millidots. Now, admittedly, a little bit low by today's standards, but more than usable. Even though we now live in a world where you can have EVF with up to like 9.5 millidots. That's too many dots. Now, again, this was a pretty big shift in the design for Micro Four Thirds cameras, and you can tell by looking at it, this is designed to look more like a serious camera, they said. Now, with the EM line being shifted more towards more serious photography, a lot of the focus went into things like ergonomics, which I'll get into later. Now, this camera also, it does video. It does 1080i at 60 frames, which was apparently made by extracting video from 1080p 30 footage. Again, not a really great video person, but, we'll take a look at the video and see how it looks later on. Now, at the time of introduction, the EM5 came out and was sold for $999 USD, or about $13.50 in modern dollar dues. In Canadian buckaroos, that is roughly 1,830 Canuck bucks, or 1,070 modern pound sterling if you're from there. Now, lastly, this camera weighs in at a paltry 425 grams, not even half a plena. Shooting with the Olympus E-M5. Now, you might have noticed that in my hands, this camera looks a bit small, and that's because it is. But don't let that fool you. Despite its small size, the camera is very comfortable to use, and this is due to the nice control arrangement as well as the right amount of contouring, letting it fit comfortably in my hands. Even though, you can see, my pinky is kind of dangling on the bottom. Now, let me demonstrate what I mean by the good control arrangement. Now I'm going to tilt the camera, and you can have a look and see that my index finger is quickly accessing a control dial, which is surrounding the shutter button. Now, if I want to change other settings with the other control dial, it's all about my thumb, which I can flick up and augment other settings. Now, another thing is that if you turn the camera around back, you see that you have a whole bunch of buttons all on the right side that you can quickly access using your thumb, as well as the power switch, which I can flick off and flick on, meaning that the majority of the camera operation can be done with just one hand, which is quite nice, with the exception of changing your mode dial there, which is on the other side of the camera, which I think is a pretty good use of space. Now, the only complaint I really have is back here. You can see the two buttons up top, which is the playback and FN1 button. For me personally, I think that the buttons are kind of set a little too far back, and it's just kind of a little annoying to hit them with my thumb. Not actually the worst, just really more of a minor little niggle. Now, as I said, the contouring on the camera is quite good. Seems, at least for me, to reasonably fit my right hand. Even though my pinky is kind of dangling there, it actually works out because it is kind of just supporting the bottom of the camera. Now, I assume that if you do have like a lot bigger hands than me, this might not be the greatest solution, but you know, if you don't have massive hands or hands that are similar to mine, I think this would be a comfortable camera to use. Now, just having a look at this, I'm fairly comfortable just holding everything with the one hand, and I think I could honestly just shoot like this. Now, this is clearly something that I think Olympus has learned from their time prior to this, building small cameras and figuring out ways to extract the maximum amount of comfort for the minimum amount of size. So that covers our ergonomics and feel. But does the camera photo? Yes, it does. As I said earlier, the camera features a 16 megapixel sensor, and I think it's still fairly solid today. Now, I know it's not a modern Micro Four Thirds sensor, it's not the 20 megapixel unit, but this 16 megapixel unit has been around for a couple iterations of Olympus camera, and it's proven that it's been a capable sensor. Now, this E-M5 doesn't have the fancy computational photography tools of newer cameras. However, it's still, again, an excellent sensor, and it still has the potential to deliver excellent photos far into the future. Now, being an older Micro Four Thirds camera, dynamic range is a little lower than with its larger sensored competition of the same era. But when you compare it to a Micro Four Thirds sensor from a more modern camera, it's actually not that big of a difference that you might think. Now, again, newer cameras are going to be better, but this isn't a huge amount off. Now, in terms of noise, again, newer cameras will be less noisy. This camera is not a high ISO king by any means, but like in my other videos, I do mention that if you run the images you get through modern noise reduction software, I think you'd be pleasantly surprised at how good the images will look. So, don't discount this when shooting at higher ISOs. Now, that's not to say leave it at ISO 25,000 and be done with it. Be smart with how you're shooting. But if you do gotta push the limits of the camera's high ISO, don't be afraid to do so. Now, another thing I want to talk about is, again, for Micro Four Thirds, the smaller sensor size, sometimes it has its downsides, sometimes it has its upsides. But let's talk about those upsides. One of those being the selection of small lenses. You might have noticed that on the camera right now sits a fairly compact lens. Now, the one I'm using is the Panasonic 14mm f2.5. And if you look at the profile of the camera, it is really thin, borderline pocketable. Now, this means that I can pack this in a small camera bag and still pack other lenses, and the whole thing weighs less than some of my larger DSLRs. And I still can carry a bunch of different lenses and swap out if I need to. Now, right now, this particular combo though is my favorite. The E-M5 with the 14mm f2.5. I basically take this camera everywhere. It fits in a bag like this, and even though this is a fairly minuscule thin bag, I actually routinely pack two 4/3 lenses in there on top of this 14mm lens. So I still have other lenses I can switch to if I need to when I'm shooting. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk about this camera's focusing. I do find for static objects, for things that aren't moving, it's fairly quick, it's fairly accurate. I do find that if you're tracking or using the tracking mode, it does kind of judder back and forth a little bit, but it's not too bad, which is good because this camera boasts a nice, frame rate of 9 frames per second. Now, let us see if we can demo that. Pretty good sound, I think. Alright, so I did mention that this camera does do the moving photos with audio, otherwise known as video mode. Now, I suspect that if you're looking at this camera to purchase, you're probably not going to be using it as a primary video shooter. After all, like I said earlier, this camera only shoots 1080i at 60 frames. The bitrate is about 20 megabits per second. So, like I said, it's not the greatest set of numbers you're going to see for video, and it also doesn't have mic input, which, again, not great. So let's have a look at some video that I've taken with the camera, and keep in mind that the video that's going to come out of this is just out of camera. I'm not going to be doing any processing to it, so it's, the full experience with the E-M5 Mark I. Let's have a look. So why is this camera great in 2024? Some of you might remember my GH1 video, where I said it's a great way to jump into Micro Four Thirds, especially on a shoestring budget. But, with the E-M5 Mark I, I found another great entry point into the system, and only for a few more dollars. And for those few dollars, you get a significant amount of more benefits. Now, firstly, the E-M5, it's a little more than the GH1, but I think it's still extremely good value. They seem to be priced somewhere between 130 USD to 220 USD. Now, with the money that you're saving, not buying a newer Micro Four Thirds camera, you can save it and use it on other things, like fantastic lenses or literally anything else. You don't have to spend it on cameras like me. You can, watch my channel and watch me spend all my money on cameras. So, save your money, use it on something else. Now, what else do you get for not so many dollars? Pretty fantastical build quality. You get excellent ergonomics that were really well thought out, and a camera that doesn't skip on modern touches like the touchscreen and your weather sealing. The sensor, while it's old, isn't actually enormously outdated. It was a mainstay feature of the Micro Four Thirds system. And the last camera to be equipped with a 16.2 megapixel sensor came out in 2019, which isn't that long ago. So as a photographic tool, I think this camera is still really competitive, especially compared to, with modern shooters that are like maybe 20 megapixels. Going from 16 to 20, yes, 20 is higher, but it's not enormously so. It's not like, jumping like 60. So I think it's still an excellent imager. Now, I think this is even more true when you compare it to similarly priced Micro Four Thirds cameras. It just offers a great value, a great sensor, and if you look at the cameras that are available in a similar price range, what you're going to find is the Olympus EP, EPL series of cameras, and those feel just like they compromise a little too much of the shooting experience for size and style, even though some of them also come with the excellent 16 megapixel shooter. Now, like I said earlier, I have the EPL5 and even have it with the VF4 Finder, but I hardly use that camera anymore. I find that its controls are just not that nice, even if the image quality is very similar. And if you're like me and you want to shoot with something at eye level, like my EPL5 had the VF4 electronic viewfinder glued onto it the entire time, and all of a sudden that camera that was similarly priced to this one kind of became more expensive by having to buy that attachment to shoot at eye level, where this camera has the built-in EVF. So, overall, this E-M5 package altogether, I think, is just an excellent camera. All said and told, and you don't have to buy an EVF to go with it. Now, that being said, I think if you are looking for an alternative to the E-M5, it seems like the Panasonic G6 might be a fairly good camera as well. I don't have one to try, but just having a look at what it's capable of, it looks to be pretty solid. And they're both released kind of at a similar time and have, I believe, the same sensor. So I definitely consider that as well, especially if you're more concerned with the video output. Alright, to wrap things up, I just want to reiterate that I had a lot of fun shooting with this camera. My favorite part was that I could pack this camera up with a couple lenses and just have a camera with me wherever I wanted to go. Even if I didn't really know what I was going to shoot, it would just be nice to have the camera there and nice to have it be so small so I can carry it and not really notice it, but still have the ability to take nice pictures. Now, as I said earlier, I don't recommend that if you do want one of these that you just go out and buy two broken ones and try to jam them together. Just recommend you get a working one from the get-go, unless you're up for a technical challenge, in which case, go for it. But, all in all, I had a fun time shooting this camera and a fun time making this video. But, let me know what your thoughts are on the E-M5 Mark I, whether or not you'd consider getting one now in 2024 or not, or what alternatives you'd have instead. And, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time. Bye!